Thank you. So it's been kind of a long journey to get here. It started about 5 kilometers away over on Busta de Vega over there back in 1945. And since then I've been gone through a few decades and many, many millions of kilometers around the world, 189 times back a little while ago. And it was great to be here and chat with you about some of this. One of the things I'll come out is it's really hard to predict things, especially the future, because a lot of times instead of things going gradually, sometimes there are jumps that are hard to predict. So this looks like a picture of Iceland. This is actually a radar image taken in 1995 by a satellite called RadarSat, one of the first major Earth observing satellites built in Canada. But I'm going to talk about spaceflight, human spaceflight, and the beginnings of that go back to our friend Newton from about 350 years ago, when he basically figured out the essential foundations of orbital mechanics way back when. And then along the way, people have dreamt about going into space. Julius Verne wrote a book of going to the moon back in 1865, about 150 years ago. And had some notions, including this one of blowing the rocket out of a big cannon into orbit. Sounds a little far-fetched, but in fact, back in the 1960s, somebody was working on doing exactly this kind of thing, launching satellites out of big cannons. The next big step is Tchaikovsky, a Russian high school math teacher who actually worked out all the principles of spaceflight, published those in 1903, and that big famous equation there, that equation we still use for all planning of all space flights in today, going to all whether we're going around the world, around the moon, or going to Mars or whatever. So all the physics was worked out more than 100 years ago. And this event here in 1957, I was 12 years old, and this really caught my attention because it was one of these surprising things. The world was a normal place, and all of a sudden, there's a satellite up there launched by Russia in 1957. And that got me thinking, boy, I don't have to be constrained by what I happen to see around me. There's other things in the world that may be interesting things to do. And that kicked off a huge space race. Wernher von Braun was one of the German scientists working in World War II on rockets, not very good ones. And he came over to the United States and became a key guy in developing the US rocket program. And at the same time, lots of people were dreaming about space flight, going to the moon, various images of people, how they might want to go to the moon, go to Mars. And people are still talking about these things. And you come up with all sorts of creative things that you can do on this. And then space stations. One of the interesting questions I get a lot is, couldn't you put artificial gravity on your space station? And he says, well, I paid a few $1 billion to get away from this stuff, so why put it back? But anyhow, so this kind of thing here, this goes back into the 60s or 70s, and stations at a point called the L5, which is these Lagrangian points. So L5 is kind of where people imagine putting things. If you put a satellite out there, it's stable compared to the Earth-Sun system. The L2, that's where the James Webb Telescope is going to go, probably in about another couple of years. It's about 10 years behind the launch date. And that's a stable point about 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth. On the Russian side, this Korolev was the equivalent of von Braun, working with the Russian program, and he was behind Sputnik and launching Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. And as a young person growing up, I watched all this, starting with Sputnik, and I really watched the early part of the space program when these guys were launching, and that kicked off a big excitement and concern in the US, and they really pushed hard to catch up to the Russians in terms of getting things into orbit. So here's the Mercury project. The guy in the background there on the left is Alan Shepard. I met him when I first got into the astronaut program. And the fellow on the back row on the right is John Glenn. I met him shortly after my spaceflight mission. So it's pretty neat to have met a few of the people that were the first ones to fly into space. And then they had Gemini, which had a couple of people in there. They did a lot of tech development on that. And of course, that led to the moon race. The Russians and the Americans really competing. The Apollo rocket is, or the Saturn V, which took the Apollo program up to the moon, is on the left here. And Russia was working on their equivalent, and they really were trying to beat the Americans to the moon. And once the Americans made it, the Russians basically shut their program down. And here's Werner von Braun standing beside the Saturn V rocket. And it's pretty impressive that the one engine makes him look really, really small. It's an incredibly large rocket. Can put 200,000 pounds into orbit. So it's pretty amazing. He went from making small rockets that are not much bigger than a man to making one of the biggest rockets that's ever flown. Anyway, so that took Apollo to the moon. This is Apollo 11, the first moon landing. So that's a picture of the lunar lander there. This is a picture of, anybody guess who this guy is? Yeah, people think it's sometimes Neil Armstrong, but there's no picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon. He took this picture. This is Buzz Aldrin, and you can see Neil reflecting in the visor. So I've met both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. I had lunch with Buzz Aldrin about 4 or 5 years ago in Detroit. Got together at the airport, talking about whatever. And this is those guys, Neil Armstrong on the left there and Buzz Aldrin on the right. Neil Armstrong died just a little while ago. Buzz Aldrin is still going strong. And then over the succeeding flights for Apollo, they had the moon buggy there. And I'm not sure who this is in the picture here, but John Young was one of the guys who did a mission around the moon. And then he did a mission, and I forget which number, where he walked on the moon and got a chance to drive that little moon buggy around. And I shared an office with John Young at the Johnson Space Center in Houston for a couple of years, and I went flying with him a couple of times in T-38s and did short field landing tests in the space shuttle. So after Apollo 17, the Apollo program got shut down, and the US was developing the space shuttle. And this is the first launch of the space shuttle on the left here, and John Young was the commander of that. And the Russians were building their own version, the Buran. It flew once into space, but they decided it was just way too expensive a program and just stayed with their rockets that launched people on smaller capsules than that. But it did fly once into space, and then the shuttle program lasted until about 2010, and it was designed primarily to assemble the space station. I got into the program a few years after that first launch of the space shuttle. Got in both on the science side and the astronaut side. And I spent quite a bit of time in Moscow at their Mission Control Center and their Russian Cosmonaut Training Center. This is one of the Russian modules for the space station. That was one of the first ones taken up there. And then I had my flight in 1997. It would be nice if it was 57, but 1997. And it is a pretty amazing experience. I went around the world 189 times. 4.5 million miles, about 10 million kilometers. I was the sole Icelander. I don't know why I was wearing a Canadian flag, but anyhow, I'm both Icelandic and Canadian in this crew that was otherwise American astronauts. And this is about 30 days before our launch, where we do a countdown practice, standing in front of the space shuttle up with the launch control tower. And this is just before I got into the space shuttle. These suit techs get us all suited up and strapped into the space shuttle. It's a grand adventure, being in space. You can look down at the Earth and see the beautiful view below you, float around. It's so easy to move around. A big mistake I made was I had a lot of my own experiments with me, and so I worked too darn hard. I should have been up there looking out the window and just enjoying myself. But I got a lot of work done, and I got my chance of doing enough floating around, and I said, it really is an amazing experience. Following 1992, collapse of the Soviet Union, basically, and the government there, the US invited Russia to join forces on building the next space station to succeed Mir space station. And this is the launch of the first part of the International Space Station, and it was put together over a period of about 10 years. 20 years from beginning the program until it was assembled. In fact, about 25 years. And so here's a picture of the space station as it looks now, and right now there are 6 people up there. And there have been continual continually people in space since about about 2000. Always from 3 to 13 people up there. Standard crew is about 6. There's a Canadian up there right now. To show this picture, this is the space shuttle docked to the space station, taken from a Russian Soyuz capsule. We're going to see something that compares to that. The space shuttle is about the size of a 737 aircraft. And here's a picture of the most number of people in space at one time. Canadians, Russians, Americans, about 13 people there in that picture. So now, right now, the only way to get to the space station is through the Russian Soyuz capsule and the Vostok launcher. So everyone launches and comes back on that now, but since the shuttle was shut down in 2010, 8 years ago, 9 years ago now, there's been developments going on, and we'll look at a couple of those. And there are still people dreaming about moon bases. Now, these are actually pictures from various NASA groups that are actually looking at different things we might put on the moon in the coming decade or so. And then there's private things that are starting to happen. So Spaceship One was Bert Rutan and a few other people were going after a $10 million prize to launch the same spacecraft up above 100 kilometers within a 2-week period. And this is Spaceship One, and they accomplished that. So they won their $10 million. It only cost them $25 million to win it. And so it just goes up on a suborbital flight, shoots up, and the whole flight is about 1 hour. You have about 4 minutes of weightlessness, and you're going on this parabolic hop. Now we've got Spaceship Two is being worked, and that is being designed to take paying passengers on these parabolic hops. Tickets are not too bad, 250 million US. Sorry, 250,000 US. That's cheaper than a flight into space, which is about 30 million US. The first one of these, unfortunately, crashed a couple of years ago. And the second one, this is the first pictures of it just from a few weeks ago, taking the second version of the Spaceship Two and testing it. And we're probably still a few years away from people actually being able to go out for a ride on this. And I say it's $250,000 for about a 1-hour ride. At the same time, the US is developing its own ways to get people up to the space station. So this is the Orion spacecraft, an SLS, a Space Launch System. And so that's being built, and the people that are training to be the first ones to fly it are in training right now. They expect to fly it with people on it for the first time, probably 2022. The first flight of it should be later this year or maybe next year. Kind of an Apollo-looking thing. But it can keep people in orbit for quite a long time, take people to the moon and other places, asteroids and things. The first mission for this unmanned going to the moon, I think is later this year, and or it might be next year, I'm not quite sure. Go over to the moon, circle it a few times and come back and land. And the first manned mission, again, will be circling the Earth. And actually, I know a few of the people that are now scheduled to be the first crew on this spacecraft. That's the NASA side. On the private side, one of these jumps in development with Elon Musk and SpaceX. So they've been building a vehicle called Dragon. And actually, it is now a resupply vehicle for the space station. But this is the first manned one of these, and again, they'll be flying the first one of these unmanned to start with this year. I think it's in April now, sorry, March. But then and actually they've done the one on the left there is the test of the recovery mechanism to getting it away in case your rocket is blowing up on you. So that's done in Florida. And then this vehicle on the right is the one that's going to go to the space station sometime in a couple of months from now. So these are very close to being ready to take people. And Elon Musk and SpaceX developed their rocket. Here's a person standing here. This is Falcon 1. It was launched 4 times, blew up on the first 3. They were just about to give up, and then they launched it one more time and it worked. And they made the jump from this little guy to this big guy. You see the size of the person down here, so this is a very large vehicle. And recently they've been doing this heavy launch one that will take Dragon 2 up there. Oops. And then what they're working on now, and I don't know how real it is yet, is this rocket here. They call it BFR. I don't know what it stands for, but and this part here is the actual manned capsule that will go up there. And so this is a huge rocket that they're developing right now, and that's a SpaceX. And this, when it docks to the space station, the shuttle was about half the size of this. This can take, if they ever build it, up to 100 people into space in one shot. And they can take, actually they've sold the first ticket on this one to go to the moon, Japanese billionaire. The ticket was only a mere 300 million US, but they're going to go to the moon in about 2023, about 4 years from now. And he's going to take some artists and journalists and things with him. And they would go on a one-way, one circle of the moon and come back and land. And then following that at some point, this manned capsule here, which is a rocket in its own self, can go to the moon and land, and you can take quite a bit of equipment and people with you on this kind of thing, and end up with a moon base of some kind. Now the timing is not so certain, but I think this is well in the works of happening, so I expect to see this kind of thing happen. Whether it's exactly this large vehicle, here's a person standing beside it, or something a little different, time will tell. See the Earth off in the distance up here. And then they tested just two days ago, just 2 days ago, the new engine for this vehicle that is going to be used to actually get their big rocket into orbit and get this manned rated capsule to the moon and onto Mars. And then they will use it to go to Mars, so that's their plan anyhow. And it can land on Mars, just like we've seen that SpaceX has been landing the boosters. And it didn't make a lot of sense from a financial point of view to be bringing those back. It still costs just about the same to launch things. But this has been a great test that SpaceX has been doing to get ready to land things on the moon and land things on Mars. And so they're expecting to land something onto Mars. And I think they're looking at 2024 or something like that. That might be a little optimistic, but it's not that far away. And then developing a little outpost on Mars and a little working town. So that's kind of in their plan. And it's not so far away. Technically, it can be done. Whether it can be done financially, not so sure. Because this represents, I don't know how many billions of dollars worth of effort to put all this together. But Musk has his eyes set on this. And he has his plans that he is going to die on Mars. Anyhow, so like I said, I've had a chance to be a part of some of this. This is a picture that my son took of my return to Earth after spending 12 days in orbit on the space shuttle. And we had a chance to look around the space shuttle. So this is just wandering around the space shuttle after they checked that it was all safe and that. I look very tired there because it was 12 days of pretty hard work up there. I came across this at some point. I forget where, but it goes from Socrates from about 2,400 years ago. Man must rise above the atmosphere and beyond to fully understand the world in which he lives. And then this picture here is the picture that I took in 1997. You can see the space shuttle up here. And you can see all of Iceland down below us here. So I feel very lucky to be here, fortunate to be here. It's taken me a few million kilometers to get here. But I had this view of Iceland along the journey, so thank you very much.